Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Sitting here Monday morning, had the opportunity to go back and watch this Oregon State game a couple of different times over the last 24 hours. Now, on Saturday afternoon, we jumped on, gave a live reaction, kind of just off the cuff, and more just a celebration of kind of finally seeing this Oregon team put it together in 2024, play the way we expected them to play all off season long. Now I got a chance to kind of gather myself a little bit, got some notes I want to dive into. And I don't think it starts with any exceptional analysis on my end. I don't think I give exceptional analysis, period, but this certainly ain't it. And that's the Oregon offensive line. Like, what's the biggest difference between the Oregon offense we've seen throughout the first couple of weeks of the 2024 season? Then you go back to 2023, it was the ability to consistently run the football and protect the passer. Like, Dillon Gabriel hasn't been excellent during the first 2 weeks, certainly was excellent on Saturday. But I think the biggest storyline was Oregon just didn't find the right starting five offensive linemen. I think the biggest storyline is they found it against Oregon State. Obviously, Poncho moving back into center, Nishad playing that guard spot. That's kind of the offensive line that we felt like was the best starting five. Oregon rocked with that every single snap of this football game, and it certainly paid off. And I don't know what the conversation looks like when Matthew Bedford gets back healthy, but the Oregon offensive line that we all saw on Saturday afternoon, that is an elite offensive line. And we knew throughout the first 2 weeks that the problem on this Oregon offensive line was not the personnel. This problem on the Oregon offensive line was them coming together and gelling, right? It was picking up stunts, picking up big blitzes, not being always on the same page. And I think some of that had to do with replacing an All-American center in Powers Johnson. You're kind of finally seeing this Oregon offensive line put it together. And I think rocking with the same starting five throughout that football game certainly helped. Now, I want to get into what we saw from the offensive line, want to get into what we saw from Dillon Gabriel and this offense, and then talk a little bit about the defense that I was kind of critical of the defense, specifically in the first half on Saturday. Getting back into the film of the defense, even in the first half, it was a pretty dang solid performance. They just, hey, Giovanni McCoy made some plays. Like, this Oregon State offense in that first half on third downs, they just made some really good plays that you just got to clap your hands about. But I thought on aggregate, the defense was even better than I thought. Rewatching this football game, fired up to get into it. Now, before we do, and as always, to the Oregon fans, one, y'all have always rocked with the boys, even in the tougher weeks that we saw in the start of 2024. I can't thank you guys enough. It's a program that y'all know I picked to win the Big Ten, was extremely high on in 2024. Love talking about. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into this one. And let's start with the offensive line. You look at the numbers here, 7.5 yards per carry. I thought this was the best game we saw from both Noah Whittington and Jordan James, but it really started with the offensive line. Again, I think there were some frustrations in terms of Will Stein calling plays the first 2 weeks of the season. I think a large part of that had to do with, Will Stein never had to call any plays behind the chains in 2023. Like, this Oregon team didn't take penalties. It didn't take sacks. It was able to run the football consistently when they wanted to. Throughout the first 2 weeks against Idaho and Boise State, penalties, sacks. Like, Will Stein's not used to calling plays when it's 3rd and 12. When it's 3rd and 3, that's when Will Stein's in his bag. When this Oregon offense is on schedule, that's when this Oregon offense was always the best. You saw Will Stein get in his bag because this offense stayed on schedule. They only allowed 2 pressures, didn't allow any sacks, 7.5 yards per carry, and only had 3 penalties for 36 yards, and 15 of those penalty yards, and Devin Jackson's roughing the passer, I think we're calling it, was kind of garbage. And so we saw this Oregon team play exceptional on the offensive line. Dillon Gabriel, clean pockets all day, had plenty of time to go through his progressions. You ran the football well. I think that was kind of the story of this Oregon offense. Now, looking at the run game, we talked about this throughout the first 2 weeks. I felt like Oregon was getting too cute in the run game, trying to do his stuff, a lot of outside the tackle stuff, a lot of stuff to the boundary. And although I think Oregon can certainly run those kind of plays, I think they have athletic enough offensive linemen to do that at times. I don't think that should be the identity of this Oregon run game. You look at this offensive line, it's a bunch of maulers. They're big bodies. They're powerful off the line of scrimmage. They can win at the point of attack. Get them working vertically downhill. the primary run scheme that we saw for Oregon against Oregon State was between the tackles, whether it was inside zone or power concepts, where we're asking our offensive linemen not to work horizontally, but to work vertically at the defense. And I thought you saw Oregon impose their will from a physicality standpoint. And I think also, like, you look at Jordan James and how he wants to run the football. Like, make no mistake, this is a kid that wants to get downhill and be very physical. And I thought you saw that to a T for this Oregon offense, specifically in the run game. Then you look at Dillon Gabriel. That was kind of the offense that we saw under Bo Nix consistently in 2023, where, yeah, we can push the ball down the field when the opportunity presents itself. Dillon Gabriel was 7 of 8, 10 plus yards down the field. He was very good pushing the ball down the field. But a lot of the production from this Oregon offense came after the catch, right? 306 passing yards, 190 of them came after the catch. And so you saw a really good balance of, hey, if Oregon State wants to squeeze down on some of those short intermediate route concepts, we can push the ball down the field. But if you are going to respect what we can do throwing the deep ball, we're going to get it to Tez Johnson. We're going to get it to Jaden Limmer and let them go to work in space. And so because this offensive line didn't give up negative plays in terms of penalties and sacks, this Oregon offense was able to run the football consistently and kind of stay on schedule, continue to allow Will Stein to be creative in terms of what plays he wanted to go to. That was the Oregon offense that we saw back in 2023. And if you can maintain that kind of offense where you're staying on schedule and you're running the football consistently, this Oregon team is going to put up 50 rather routinely on a lot of opponents, because there's just not a lot of teams. When you get Dillon Gabriel blocked up and you protect him, how many defenses across the country can deal with Terrence Ferguson and Kenyon Sadiq at the tight end spot, and then Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden at the wide receiver spot? There's just too much firepower for Dillon Gabriel to work with. Perfect as it gets for Oregon on the offensive side of the football. Now, going to the defensive side of the football, obviously very good in the second half, shut Oregon State out. Going back to the first half and what we saw, I think first you got to give a ton of credit to Oregon State. I mean, Giovanni McCoy's a gamer, and he's a guy that can kind of pull some rabbits out of his hats, whether it's with his athleticism, running the football, or just extending plays outside the pocket. Dan Lanning said it, I believe, after the first quarter, and he just got, hey, we're playing good on defense. We're being very disruptive. We just got to keep Giovanni McCoy in the pocket and stop letting him extend plays. You saw Oregon make those halftime adjustments, and they came out and played a very, very good brand of football on the defensive side of the football the second half. Obviously, we noted Bryce Betcher going back and watching. He's putting it together, man. Like, Bryce Betcher not only led the team in tackles and in run stops, but he was exceptional in coverage. And I think that's going to be really, really important for Oregon as they continue to kind of ramp up the competition. You look at a team like Ohio State, they're going to want to spread you out. They're going to want to force your linebackers to play in space. If you're Oregon, you got to have linebackers that not only can be thumpers in the run game, but also go sideline to sideline, whether it's carrying tight ends up the seam, tackling running backs in the flat. Bryce Betcher I thought he's the best player on defense for Oregon Saturday afternoon. Devin Jackson, some mental mistakes on the screen. And I think Devin Jackson, I mean, we said this right after the game. Like, this kid, when he finally puts it together consistently, I think is the most talented linebacker on this Oregon team, really one of the more talented football players on this team. This kid is physically gifted as it gets. You can still tell that the instincts and kind of understanding his responsibility and doing what he needs to do, it's still coming along. It's certainly gotten a heck of a lot better. And I get why Dan Lanning keeps throwing him out there, because when this kid clicks, he's going to be one of the best backers, really not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. And so you're seeing consistent improvement from Devin Jackson. You're seeing some really good depth kind of get built up in that Oregon front seven where, all right, Jeff Boss is going to be your guy. But when he's on a pitch count and he's kind of banged up, do we have other linebackers that we can trust? You're certainly seeing that. On the defensive line, Derek Harmon continues to just be an absolute dude. And again, he was extremely disruptive. I don't think it's necessarily reflected on the box score, but we wanted to see Oregon defensive linemen kind of step up and be difference makers. We highlighted Tatum Tuioti after the Boise State game. Derek Harmon, every single game this year, has been exactly what Oregon's been looking for on the inside of the defensive line. Last year, you go back and say, hey, we had some solid pieces on the inside of the defensive line, but they weren't quite game wreckers. So when you played a team like Washington, could you have a defensive lineman that could just really take over and really affect the passer from the pocket? I don't know if Oregon had that last year on the inside outside of Brandon Dorlus, who was kind of moved all around. Derek Carman's that guy for Oregon. He's exactly what we thought he was going to be coming from Michigan State. That's going to matter, especially when you play a team like Ohio State, where you're looking at how do you want to play Ohio State? How can you win that football game? I think it starts with getting after that Ohio State offensive line, which is probably their weakest part of their football team. If Oregon can continue to ramp it up on the defensive line, you talk about how they match up against Ohio State. I think they could take it to Ohio State on the offensive line. Moving back to the secondary, again, this secondary continues to be really good. And Giovanni McCoy, 22 of 34, 172 yards. There were some really good throwing catches that you saw Oregon State made. I continue to say the throwing windows are not very big. And I love when this Oregon team goes to man coverage. And I get they didn't want to play a ton of man coverage in the first half because they were concerned about McCoy and what he could do with his legs. So they wanted guys seeing McCoy. So when he gets outside the pocket, when he decides to use his feet, we can rally to the ball carrier. If you can just handle McCoy, whether it's quarterback spy, whether it's be disciplined with your rush lanes, when this Oregon team goes to man coverage, there's just not a lot of wide receivers that can separate on these defensive backs. I think you have a lot of different guys, obviously headlined by Jabbar Muhammad. It's a really hard secondary to separate with. And so if you can go to man coverage and you can pin your ears back and get after the passer, and this Oregon defense can be sticky in coverage, it's going to be a really hard defense to consistently move the football on. Again, this was the most complete performance, specifically in that second half when the defense really started to turn it up. Again, this offense was nearly perfect. I think the one critique you could have was Tez Johnson in the red zone. Just again, you're seeing Dillon Gabriel and Tez Johnson, I think, just continue to try to work to get on the same page. There's not that inherent chemistry that Bo Nix and Tez Johnson had in 2023, which is understandable. But as Dillon Gabriel and Tez continue to build that chemistry, which is certainly there, Tez Johnson went 7 for $110. It's going to happen. I think they're going to clean some of those mistakes up where it's not like Dillon Gabriel missed a pass. I think he expected Tez Johnson to flare it out a little bit more. That's more of a communication chemistry thing in terms of, hey, Tez, how are you going to run this route? And then where do I need to put the football? That's not Dillon Gabriel missing those throws. Exact same one we talked about for the Boise State game a week ago. Again, you're seeing this team consistently get better. You've seen improvement every single game. Like Idaho was a disaster, just played sloppy, bad football. Didn't play that great against Boise State, but better. And then you saw them really put it together. And I think the fun part is, what if they keep getting better? Like, what if this team continues to build on what they're doing, especially going into a bye week, getting guys back healthy? It's going to be a fun team. And I think we're all just excited to see what we expected to see from this Oregon program. We'll close it out there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.